In most cases, a soldering tip stops taking solder, turns black, or develops a pit due to several mistakes. Why does this happen? Let's take a look for the reasons. The first reason: modern soldering tips wears out because of too high soldering temperature. Many believe that if you increase the temperature to 400 degrees Celsius, soldering will become easier. Soldering is indeed easier, but this destroys the soldering iron tip very quickly. The iron coating oxidizes and wears out faster. The flux decomposes quicker, the tips get covered with oxidized and carbon residues faster. After that, the solder begins to wet the surface of soldering iron tip poorly. And if you use active or some kind of acid fluxes in your work, that fluxes destroys the tip coating even faster, and the service life for soldering iron tip is shortened quicker. The typical soldering temperature for leaded solders is 320 degrees Celsius, and for lead-free solders 350 degrees Celsius. It is important to use a soldering station with the ability to set the temperature accurately. The second reason is long heating without work. If you don't solder for a long time and the soldering iron is constantly in a heated state, then this simply burns out the protective coating of the tip. It turns black and stops being wetted by solder. If your soldering station supports sleep or standby mode, be sure to use it. The sleep function appeared in professional manufacturing not by accident. They not only save electricity but also noticeably increase the service life of the tips. Reason 3. Improper cleaning of the soldering iron tip. When the solder stops sticking, many take sandpaper or a needle file. On modern interchangeable tips, this cannot be done. You remove not only dirt but also scrape off the protective iron coating. As soon as copper core is exposed, the molten solder begins to gradually dissolve the copper and pits are formed. After that, you need a new tip. For cleaning, it is better to use brass tip cleaner or wet sponge. And in case of severe oxidation, a tip thinner. Reason 4. Lead-free soldering. There is a view that lead-free solders quickly wears out the soldering iron tip, but this is not quite true. The problem is not lead-free solder itself, but in the high temperature 350 degrees Celsius. In addition, the tip works longer in harsher conditions. That is why in lead-free soldering wear occurs faster. But some solder manufacturers, such as Koki, have series of solders that contain additives that allow protecting the tip when working with lead-free solders. And right now, subscribe to the channel and click the bell so you don't miss the next video. Reason 5. Oxidized components and PCB pads. When soldering oxidized leads or oxidized PCB pads, it is often necessary to scrape the parts with soldering iron tip. To facilitate soldering in cases of heavy oxidation, highly active fluxes are sometimes used. All this action damages the iron tip coating. It is better to use new parts. Reason 6. Cheap soldering irons and tips for them. Of course, cheap tools are almost always the worst the manufacturing quality. There is no point for a manufacturer of cheap soldering irons and tips to invest expensive technologies in products. There is only one way out here: to buy a high-quality soldering station like a Weller, JBC, Hakko, Metcol or Pace. Many are skeptical about this, but my experience has shown that the high-quality soldering station not only allows you to solder with one tip for a long time, but also brings comfort when soldering. Is it possible to restore a tip? If the iron tip surface is simply covered with black burns or oxidized, sometimes a tip thinner helps. It removes dust and allows you to thin the working iron tip surface again. But if the protective iron tip coating is already damaged and the copper core has begun to dissolve, it is impossible to restore such a tip. Only replacement with a new one. No pastes or chemical composition can return the factory coating. How to extend the service life of the tip? There is a few rules. Use a correct temperature. Do not keep the soldering station hot while idle. If there is a sleep mode, be sure to use it with a shutdown interval of 1 minute. When necessary, use a tip thinner. The average conditional lifespan of a soldering iron tip in mixed manufacturing condition is from 10,000 solder joints when used in various modes. An average PCB assembler can make from 500 to 3000 solder joints per day. Remember that a soldering iron tip is consumable and take it easier. Many advise that before putting the soldering iron in the stand, you must wet the iron tip with solder and leave it to cool down. I consider tip damage due to a dry tip to be insignificant if you use correct temperatures and do not leave the soldering iron heated for a long time. No one leaves unclouded irons turned on for a long time. No magic way that will allow one tip to work forever. There is no such way. There is soldering discipline and there are physical realities. Buy a few spare tips and just change them. Write in the comments how long a soldering tip lasts for you. For those who want to solder with high quality fluxes, I will leave a link at Diamond Flux products in the description. Like this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel and to my Patreon. Thank you so much.